In June 1945, two Japanese professors captured at Okinawa braced for torture in an American POW camp. But instead, a U.S. sergeant asked them to help organize a library filled with Shakespeare, Einstein, and Plato, the very books Japan had burned and banned as dangerous Western thought. Walking through aisles stacked with thousands of forbidden masterpieces while their families starved back home, they realized something that shattered everything they'd been taught about America's cultural wasteland. What did these enemy prisoners discover in that Wisconsin camp library that made them understand Japan had already lost the war? Not on the battlefield, but in the battle of ideas. In June 1945, the Pacific War burned across the ocean like a terrible fire that would not stop. For 3 long years, Japan had been fighting America and its allies, and the Japanese military government controlled everything the people could know, or say, or think. Every newspaper in Tokyo printed only stories of victory, even when battles were lost. Every radio broadcast called Americans monsters and barbarians who had no books, no art, no culture worth knowing. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, watched everyone like hawks circling prey. They arrested anyone who questioned the war. They burned any book that came from the West. Universities had become something else entirely. Tokyo Imperial University once held the greatest minds in Japan, professors who taught philosophy from Germany and literature from England and science from all over the world. But those days were gone, like smoke in wind. Liberal professors had been forced out or arrested. Western books were thrown into bonfires in the university courtyards. The philosophy department was shut down completely. Students no longer sat in quiet rooms debating ideas. Instead, they marched in formation and practiced with wooden rifles and memorized speeches about the emperor's divine right to rule all of Asia. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura was 52 years old, and he remembered better days. He had once taught Immanuel Kant and Georg Hegel to rooms full of eager students. He had spent years studying how humans think about right and wrong, about freedom and duty, about what makes a society good. Now he taught something called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere Ideology, which was just a fancy name for lessons about why Japan should control every country from India to Australia. Every word he spoke in class was a lie he had to tell to stay alive and keep his family fed. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto was 47 and carried an even heavier burden. He had translated American novels into Japanese, beautiful stories that showed him a country full of dreamers and fighters and people who questioned everything. He had loved those books like old friends. Then the government banned them all. They were dangerous, the officials said. They would poison Japanese minds with ideas about individual freedom and democracy. Yamamoto had to watch his own translations burned. He had to pretend he never loved those stories. The Imperial Navy decided these two educated men might be useful. Japan needed translators who could speak English, people who could question American prisoners and read captured documents. So Nakamura and Yamamoto were given uniforms they did not want and sent to Okinawa, where one of the war's bloodiest battles was tearing the island apart. For weeks they lived in caves and dugouts, hungry and afraid, listening to American bombs shake the earth. They translated captured letters and helped interrogate the few American prisoners Japan managed to take. Those interrogations were ugly, brutal things. The Japanese officers believed Americans were less than human. On a burning hot day in June, American forces overran their position. Nakamura and Yamamoto raised their hands in surrender, their hearts pounding so hard they thought their chests might break. Their own officers had told them terrible stories about what Americans did to prisoners. "They eat Japanese soldiers alive," one general had said. "They torture you for fun. They have no honor, no mercy, no souls." As American Marines surrounded them with rifles pointed at their heads, both professors expected to die within hours, maybe minutes. Instead, they were put on a transport ship, given water and rice, and sent across the Pacific Ocean. The journey took 3 weeks. They were crammed into the hold with other prisoners, all of them waiting for the torture to begin. It never came. American guards were firm, but not cruel. The food was plain, but there was enough of it. Nakamura kept thinking this must be a trick, some elaborate game before the real suffering started. The ship arrived in California, and the prisoners were loaded onto trains. For days they traveled east across America, staring out windows at a country that should not exist according to everything they had been taught. They saw massive factories with no bomb damage. They saw farms so large they stretched to the horizon. They saw cities lit up at night like someone had scattered stars across the ground. There was no hunger here, no destruction, no darkness. Japan had told them America was weak and dying, a country with no culture and no strength. But Nakamura watched American workers leaving factories in automobiles, not walking home hungry like Japanese workers did. He watched trains carrying enough food to feed Tokyo for a month. Something was very wrong with the story he had believed. They arrived at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin in late June. The camp sat in rolling green hills surrounded by pine forests. Clean barracks stood in neat rows. There was a mess hall that could feed 1,000 men. There was a hospital with real doctors and medicine. There was even a baseball field. Nakamura and Yamamoto were processed, given clean uniforms, assigned to a barracks. They waited for the cruelty to start. On their 3rd day, an American sergeant came to their barracks. He was young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles. He looked at a clipboard, and then at them. "You gentlemen professors," he asked in slow, careful English. Nakamura and Yamamoto nodded, afraid to speak. The sergeant smiled. "We got a library," he said. "Thought you might want to help organize it. You know, sort books, help other prisoners find reading material. Interested?" Both professors stood frozen. Their minds could not process the words they just heard. A library. For prisoners. Books. Help organize it. This had to be some kind of trap or trick or test. But the sergeant just stood there waiting for an answer. Patient and calm like he had asked the simplest question in the world. "What kind of books?" Yamamoto finally whispered. The sergeant shrugged. "All kinds," he said. "We got fiction, history, science, philosophy. Even got some stuff in Japanese we ordered special. Come on, I will show you." The library occupied a converted barracks about 200 feet from where Nakamura and Yamamoto slept. Walking there felt like walking in a dream where nothing made sense anymore. The sergeant opened the door, and the smell hit them first. Old paper and leather and wood polish, the exact smell of Tokyo Imperial University Library before the war. Nakamura felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. The room stretched 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. And more shelves stood in rows down the middle. Books filled every inch of space. Thousands of them. Maybe 10,000. Under bright electric lights, the spines glowed in every color. Reading tables sat near the windows with proper wooden chairs, not broken stools or bare floor. In the corner, a small desk held a card catalog system with neat handwritten labels. Nakamura walked forward like a man in a trance. His fingers traced along the spines, and his breath came in short gasps. The complete works of Shakespeare. The Republic by Plato. The Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. Democracy in America by Tocqueville. Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. The Origin of Species by Darwin. Relativity. The Special and General Theory by Albert Einstein. Every book Japan had banned. Every author Japan had called dangerous. Every idea Japan had tried to erase from the world. Yamamoto made a choking sound and pulled a book from the shelf with shaking hands. The Tale of Genji, in English translation. Japan's greatest work of literature, written 1,000 years ago by Lady Murasaki, now sitting in an American prison camp library in Wisconsin. He opened it and saw a stamp inside. Property of the United States Army, donated by the Milwaukee Public Library System for prisoner education and welfare. "This cannot be real," Yamamoto whispered. "These are the books they told us Americans had destroyed. They said Americans burned libraries and hated learning and cared only for money and machines." The sergeant laughed, not mean but genuinely amused. "Burned libraries," he said. "Mister, we got more libraries than we know what to do with. Every town has one. Every school. Most churches, too." His voice grew more serious. "Look, you guys are prisoners. Yeah, but that does not mean we want you to be stupid. Smart prisoners make less trouble. Plus, maybe you learn something useful for when you go home." Over the next week, Nakamura and Yamamoto became the library's caretakers. They organized books by subject, created a better catalog system, helped other prisoners find what they wanted to read. More shocks came every day. On Wednesday, an American professor from the University of Wisconsin arrived to give a lecture on constitutional democracy. 70 prisoners attended. No guards stopped them. No one monitored what was said. The professor explained how American government worked, how citizens could vote out leaders they disliked, how courts could tell even the president he was wrong. In Japan, such talk would get you arrested or killed. On Friday, the camp received a shipment of new books. Japanese language books ordered special from California. Poetry by Basho and Issa. Novels by Natsume Soseki. Philosophy texts. The Americans had spent real money to buy books in Japanese for their enemies to read. Nakamura held a volume of Buddhist sutras and tried to understand a world where this made sense. The following Tuesday brought something even stranger. Discussion groups started meeting twice a week. Prisoners could choose topics they wanted to debate. One group studied American literature. Another focused on political science. A third explored mathematics and engineering. American volunteers, professors, and teachers from nearby towns came to lead discussions and answer questions. They treated the prisoners like students, not enemies. They encouraged disagreement and questions. They smiled when prisoners challenged their ideas. During a humid afternoon in July, Nakamura sat reading John Locke's second treatise of government when an American Red Cross volunteer arrived pushing a cart. She was an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She handed out bottles of Coca-Cola, ice cold and sweating in the summer heat. Nakamura stared at the bottle in his hand. Condensation dripped onto his palm. The liquid inside was dark and mysterious, and came from a country he was supposed to hate. He thought about his wife and daughters back in Tokyo. They were probably eating weeds and tree bark to survive. His youngest daughter was 7, and he had not seen her in a year. She had never tasted sugar in her whole life, because Japan had none to spare. Here, American guards gave enemy prisoners luxury beverages just for sitting and reading books on a Tuesday afternoon. Yamamoto sat across from him, holding his own Coca-Cola like it might explode. He met Nakamura's eyes, and neither man needed to speak. They both understood the same terrible truth was growing in their minds. Everything was backwards. Everything was wrong. Or maybe everything they had believed was wrong. That night, Yamamoto started teaching English classes to younger prisoners using American novels. He chose The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck because it showed poor Americans suffering during hard times. But as he taught, he realized something that made his stomach hurt. This book criticized America. It showed American failure and cruelty and injustice, and Americans had published it anyway. They taught it in schools. They put it in libraries. They let their enemies read it. In Japan, Yamamoto would be executed for writing such criticism of the government. His family would be shamed. His name would be erased. But Americans were strong enough, confident enough, brave enough to publish their own failures and discuss them openly. They did not fear questions. They did not fear truth. Nakamura started requesting books on American history. He read about the Revolution and the Civil War and the Great Depression. He read about mistakes and crimes and terrible things America had done. All of it available freely, written by Americans, preserved carefully, shared openly. A country that could look at itself honestly was a country that could not be defeated by lies. Both men began to suspect something neither could say out loud yet. Maybe America had not won the war with bombs and ships and soldiers. Maybe America had already won years ago by building a society that trusted ideas more than fear, that chose open debate over blind obedience, that believed educated enemies were better than ignorant ones. The library was not a prize of war. It was proof of a completely different way of thinking about power. August 15th arrived like any other summer day, but it would change everything. The morning started with rumors spreading through the camp like wildfire through dry grass. Something big had happened. Something about Japan. Something about the emperor. Guards spoke in hushed voices and looked at the Japanese prisoners with expressions that mixed pity and relief, and something else Nakamura could not name. At 2 in the afternoon, the camp commander gathered all prisoners in the main assembly area. A radio sat on a table at the front, its dark fabric speaker pointing at hundreds of silent men. The commander's face was serious, but not cruel. He spoke slowly so everyone could understand. "Your emperor is about to make an announcement," he said. "We are going to let you listen. Whatever you hear, whatever you feel, you are safe here. No one will hurt you." The radio crackled to life, and Emperor Hirohito's voice came through, thin and distant and speaking in formal Japanese that many soldiers had never heard before. The emperor never spoke to common people. His voice was supposed to be too sacred for human ears, but now he spoke, and his words were like hammer blows. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have resolved to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. The empire accepts the provisions of the joint declaration. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. 3,000 Japanese prisoners sat in absolute silence as the radio went dead. Some men cried. Some sat frozen like statues. Some covered their faces with their hands. Nakamura felt the world tilt and spin. Everything he had suffered for. Everyone who had died. All the cities burned and families destroyed. And now it was simply over, because the emperor said so. The camp commander waited 5 full minutes before speaking again. "The library will remain open tonight," he said quietly, "for those who wish to understand what comes next." Then he walked away and left the prisoners alone with their grief and shock and confusion. Nakamura found himself walking to the library as the sun set. He did not decide to go. His feet just carried him there. Inside, he found dozens of other prisoners, all sitting silently at tables or standing before shelves like they were searching for answers in the spines of books. Yamamoto was already there, holding a copy of the United States Constitution with both hands, like it was something precious and fragile. Nakamura chose the Federalist Papers, a collection of essays written by America's founders explaining why their new constitution would work. He had never read them before because they were banned in Japan. He sat under a bright lamp and began to read. The words were difficult, and his English was not perfect, but he pushed through page after page, hour after hour. As midnight approached, he pulled out the small notebook he kept hidden in his uniform and began to write. For 3 years, I taught students that democracy was weakness. I told them individual rights destroyed national unity and made countries soft and easy to defeat. I believed this because I was told to believe it and because I was afraid to question. But here in this camp, I see the truth I was too blind to see before. The Americans defeat us not despite their freedoms, but because of them. Their strength comes from debate, from disagreement, from the very chaos we called disorder. When people can think freely, they can solve problems we cannot even see. When people can question their leaders, those leaders must be better or be replaced. When people can read any book and discuss any idea, they become stronger, not weaker. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned. Across the room, Yamamoto was teaching a small group of young prisoners using the grapes of wrath. Nakamura watched and listened. Yamamoto held up the book, and his voice was thick with emotion. "This book shows Americans suffering," he said. "It shows their government failing them. It shows rich people being cruel to poor people. It criticizes America deeply and honestly. And you know what Americans did? They published it. They taught it in schools. They gave it awards. They put it in libraries and told the whole world to read it." A young prisoner, maybe 19 years old, raised his hand. "Why would they do that?" he asked. "Why would they show their weakness to enemies?" Yamamoto's eyes filled with tears. "Because they are strong enough to question themselves," he said. "In Japan, I would be executed for writing such criticism. My family would be destroyed. But Americans understand something our leaders never learned. A country that hides the truth is weak. A country that faces the truth, even ugly truth, becomes stronger. They trust their own people to think and decide and argue. We were taught to obey without question. That is why we lost." The next week, American authorities announced that prisoners could take college courses if they wanted. Real classes taught by real professors from the University of Wisconsin. Engineering, agriculture, political science, literature, mathematics, all free. All available to men who had been trying to kill Americans just months before. Nakamura enrolled in a constitutional law class without hesitation. Yamamoto chose American literature. The first constitutional law class met on a Thursday morning. The professor was an old man with white hair and glasses that sat crooked on his nose. He wrote his name on a chalkboard, Professor Harold Chen. Then he turned to face 15 Japanese prisoners and smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are going to study how power should be limited by law. We are going to learn why no person, not even a president or emperor, should have absolute control. We are going to explore why freedom of speech and freedom of thought are not luxuries, but necessities for any good society." Nakamura sat in that classroom and felt something break inside him. Not break like a bone, but break like chains falling away. For years he had been imprisoned by lies, by fear, by propaganda that told him to hate and obey and never question. Now, in an actual prison camp, surrounded by barbed wire and guards with guns, he felt free for the first time in a decade. That night he wrote again in his notebook, "I came here expecting camps like Bataan, where Japanese soldiers tortured Americans until they died. I expected cruelty like Nanking, where Japanese troops murdered Chinese civilians for sport. Instead, they gave me Plato and Shakespeare and Einstein. They did not force me to abandon my ideas. They gave me books and asked me to think. This is a power our generals never understood, a power stronger than any army or bomb. It is the power to let truth defend itself." The ship carrying Dr. Nakamura back to Japan left San Francisco in March 1946. In his trunk sat 20 books, gifts from the camp library and his American professors. The librarian had wrapped them carefully in brown paper and tied them with string. A signed copy of Democracy and Education by John Dewey sat on top with an inscription that read, "To Dr. Nakamura, may these ideas help rebuild what war destroyed." Professor Harold Chen had written his name in careful script, along with the date. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks, and Nakamura spent most of it on deck staring at the gray water. He was going home, but home was not the place he left. Letters from his wife told him Tokyo was destroyed, that their house was gone, that his daughters were thin as ghosts. She asked him what he had learned in America. He did not know how to answer. How could he explain in a letter that everything he believed had been wrong? How could he tell her that their enemies had been kinder to him than their own government ever was? The ship arrived in Yokohama harbor on a cold morning with rain falling like tears from heavy clouds. The city that once stretched for miles was now acres of ash and broken concrete. Buildings stood like broken teeth, craters filled with dirty water. People moved through the ruins like shadows, their faces empty of hope. American occupation forces directed traffic and handed out food from trucks. Nakamura watched Japanese children line up for rice balls given by American soldiers, and he thought about ice-cold Coca-Cola on summer afternoons in Wisconsin. His wife met him at the processing center. She looked 10 years older than when he left. Her cheeks were hollow and her hands were rough from hard work. But when she saw him, her eyes filled with light, and she ran to him like a young girl. They held each other and cried, and did not speak for a long time, because words felt too small for what they felt. That night in the small room they now called home, his wife asked what he brought from America. The room was barely 12 feet square, with thin walls and a ceiling that leaked. They shared it with another family, separated only by a hanging blanket. Nakamura opened his trunk and showed her the books. 20 volumes that somehow survived the journey across an ocean. His wife touched them gently like they might break. "These," he said quietly, "are why we lost. Not their bombs or ships or soldiers. These ideas, these books, this trust in human thought. We banned Shakespeare while they made every prisoner read him. We burned books while they built libraries. We taught fear while they taught questions." Walking through Tokyo the next day felt like walking through a graveyard. His university was a pile of rubble with a few walls still standing like tombstones. The library, where he had studied as a young man, was completely gone, erased as if it never existed. But American occupation forces were already rebuilding. He watched them construct schools and hospitals. He saw them establishing lending libraries in neighborhoods. He watched American soldiers playing baseball with Japanese children and handing out chocolate bars. The same pattern everywhere. abundance, education, kindness to defeated enemies. Dr. Yamamoto found him a week later. His friend looked older, too, worn down by loss and hunger and grief. But his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had survived everything. They walked through the ruins together and talked about what came next. Yamamoto had already been asked to help establish a new Department of American Studies at the university once it was rebuilt. He wanted Nakamura to join him. "We have to teach the truth now," Yamamoto said. "We have to tell students what we learned. We have to make sure Japan never makes these mistakes again." Nakamura also received an invitation, this one from the committee writing Japan's new constitution. They needed advisors who understood democracy, who had studied American and European political thought. Nakamura thought about those nights in Wisconsin reading Madison and Jefferson under bright electric lights. He thought about Professor Chen explaining how law should limit power. He accepted the invitation. Months passed, and slowly, painfully, Japan began to change. The new constitution guaranteed freedoms that had never existed before. Freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom to criticize the government without fear. Universities reopened with new missions focused on open inquiry and debate. Libraries were built in every city with books from all over the world. The ideas that had been banned were now required reading. In 1950, Dr. Yamamoto stood before a classroom of young students at the rebuilt University of Tokyo. They were the first generation to grow up in the new Japan, children who had never known the old ways of blind obedience and enforced ignorance. He held up his worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath and told them his story. "In the camp library, I expected propaganda," he said. "I expected them to fill our heads with lies about American superiority. Instead, I found Thoreau questioning his own government. I found books that criticized everything from capitalism to racism to war itself. I expected cultural imperialism, Americans forcing their ideas down our throats. Instead, I found them preserving Basho's poetry in English translation, treating our culture with respect, even while we were enemies." He paused and looked at each young face. "They defeated us militarily. Yes," he continued, "but more importantly, they freed us intellectually. The cruelest prisons are not the ones with barbed wire and guards. The cruelest prisons are the ones we build in our own minds, with censorship and fear and refusing to ask questions. America did not just defeat Japan. America showed us a different way to be strong." By 1960, Dr. Nakamura was an old man with white hair and trembling hands. He gave a lecture to graduate students studying political philosophy. He held up his copy of Plato's Republic, the same book he had pulled from the shelf that first day in Camp McCoy 15 years before. The binding was worn, and the pages were soft from being read hundreds of times. "I went to war believing America had no culture worth preserving," he told the students. "I returned knowing Japan had no future without the very freedoms I once scorned. The Americans won our war before the first bomb fell. They won it by building libraries where we built censorship bureaus. They won it by trusting ideas where we trusted only force. They won it by being confident enough in truth that they did not fear questions." He set the book down gently on his desk. "The greatest thing I learned as a prisoner? That a nation confident in truth does not fear questions. That real strength is not silencing Shakespeare, but sharing him with your enemies. That the most dangerous weapon is not the atomic bomb. The most dangerous weapon is the open book, the free mind, the person who thinks for themselves." The students sat in silence, absorbing his words. Outside the window, Tokyo stretched in every direction, rebuilt and thriving and free. On campus, a new library was being built, the largest in Asia. A plaque would be placed at its entrance, dedicating the collection to prisoners of war who discovered freedom in captivity. The books that had survived fire and censorship and war would finally have a permanent home in a country that had learned the hard way that ideas cannot be defeated by force, only by better ideas freely chosen.